11 years ago, the Widow Mine was created. This has made a lot of people very angry. It has been widely regarded as a bad move. But today, we're not removing it, but we're looking at it for the first time, maybe in 11 years, in a new light, as you can see here. But more on that. For the first time in not too long, a new patch from the Divisive Balance Council of StarCraft 2. This is a real patch, not an in-season April Fool's joke, but instead another iteration, especially considering the previous patch, patch 5.0.12, which we're referencing here immediately from the Balance Council. A big effort from the Community Balance Council, which I'm not a part of, just to be clear, to maintain something resembling objectivity and to be able to voice these strong opinions with a bias towards showing good games for the fans, which I like to think I'd like and subscribe, by the way. Jimmy, 1,264 likes, and I'll continue to voice strong opinions. But we'd like to thank everyone for providing their feedback and to apologize for us not being able to communicate proactively. Fair. While we believe that some of the previous patch goals were successfully achieved, other goals related to the Protoss versus Terran comment matchup are yet to be accomplished. Certain changes originally received mixed feedback, speaking of, from the community, and also led to unintentional consequences, particularly cyclones, everywhere. DVT as well. The Terrans are suffering. Needs another look. With the upcoming patch, we'd like to take a more careful approach and focus on fewer goals to improve the current state of the game. The pro gamers involved feel that TVZ, Terran vs. Zerg, and Protoss vs. Zerg don't require any major changes. In the upcoming patch goals, improve the state of Protoss vs. Terran at the professional level, mainly accomplished by changes to Terran units, because of course, and address community concerns about the most oppressive openings like Cyclones and Widow Mine drops. Implement quality of life improvements and the small changes proposed by the map-making community to give more freedom and competitive map design. I like it. All right, I agree with all those things. I personally agree, from both a player and a spectator perspective, that Terran vs. Zerg, for the most part, feels balanced. The design there's some rough edges, for sure, but it feels like it could go either way, especially if we put Cyril in his own category. Protoss versus Zerg, I think, is actually the most exciting matchup right now, where it feels like both sides have good opportunities at most stages of the game to kind of at least have options for how to play it out and not be kind of pigeonholed really past like the 3-minute mark, because we all know it's going to be Stargate versus 3-base, but still. In general, especially more than Protoss versus Terran, where it comes down to essentially you're going blank or you're gambling, which is how most Protoss feel at the moment, and generally not as entertaining a matchup for me as a caster, because it feels like either it's an early pressure that does a decisive timing for the Protoss, or the Terran's able to get critical damage done. And if that doesn't end the game, we sit in our base for like 3, 4, 5 minutes, because the armies are so good against each other, they can't really fight without risking losing everything. So it's not as dynamic a matchup between Terran and Protoss, and it does seem like the initiative favors the Terran pretty dramatically. So how are we dealing with that? All right. Versus. All the changes are versus, so it's a bit of a misnomer. We're going to go through each race. I'm going to try to break down the relevant points, but I'm going to fail at this, and then talk about them for matchups as a whole later on. So, Advanced Ballistics range bonus, reduced from 3 to 2. Still allows that extra ability to engage armies. And this change has the side effects of reducing uninteractive scenarios where ground units have no way to get in range, especially behind mineral lines, which is a big concern for map makers especially, because you kind of have to design mineral lines around the idea that a Liberator could siege up and potentially invalidate the entire mineral line, which is obviously not great. And after Terran amassing a large number of Liberators with +2 weapons, which 2-shot Stalkers, 1 shot after EMP, a very oppressive unit that I think it stands to reason deserves a nerf. And I think this is about as soft-handed of a nerf as you can get. It is only after you get range, and even then, there's still a significant range increase, allowing them to outrange the overwhelming majority of ground units, forcing those units to get into range in order to engage. The Widow Mine. Getting right into it. So the summary is, there was an attempt to improve the targeting line in the previous patch that, for technical reasons, was removed. There was an attempt made, apparently, but they weren't able to execute it for whatever reason. But this time around, as you can see, we have an actual targeting line. And if you look closely, I'm sure you'll see this in the games, it's actually highlighting the unit that is being attacked with something like the Seeker missile effect. I guess the anti-armor missile is also like that, but... So now you can see which probe is about to be massacred, and the line kind of lights up and thickens and biggins with that red targeting laser over time. Not going to stop you from losing your units, but gives you a bit more opportunity to deal with it and potentially split away from it. And invisibility while reloading now requires drilling claws instead of just an armory. So goodbye early armory drops. Drilling claws may end up being a thing, but the splash damage radius is reduced from 1.75 to 1.5, as well as giving an attack alert when it's burrowing in range of enemy units, as opposed to when it's already hit them. So that window is not going to matter too much to anyone but higher level players, but it is a larger window. And all of this is outright a nerf. And there's more coming, Terrans. Not nerfs, buffs, actually, but... Alright. These all seem reasonable. Now the splash damage radius is only slightly larger than that of a Disruptor. It is in line with the EMP radius. And in general, hitting huge clumps of things like probes, well, workers in general, mutas, Zerglings, Banelings, or the splash damage around Zealots, is going to be reduced, but still it is retaining its ability to single target kill pretty much most lower tier units and some higher tier ones in the game. So I think this was... Saying it's long overdue is an understatement. Just the targeting line itself. I think I've shown a couple examples of what could be done with it. I think this is a solid way to show. I haven't seen too many like real game examples, but it does seem like a lot easier to deal with. On top of the fact that the alert will help some players, especially at that higher level or even pro level, react just a little bit quicker, which would make all the difference. So, a solid and inarguable nerf. There is no part of this that is a buff to the Widowmine. So, but Armory cost reduced from 150, 100 to 150, 50. And on the other side of things, infantry weapon and armor upgrades are cheaper. Starting at +2, they now cost 175 or 150 and 200, down 25 and down 25 and 50 research. I assume this means minerals and gas because they are the same. Just we're being a little lazy in describing it. Changes to slightly smoothen out the transition for Terran into mid-game upgrades on both fronts here. Partially to offset the nerfs to other Terran units expected to have a greater impact in TVP than TVC. I think that's true. And I want to point out, before we get into more Cyclone stuff, yes, we're back. The Armory cost reduction. I think now that it's essentially divorced from the Widowmine somewhat, Drilling Claws requires an armory and a tech lab factory, which is quite a barrier to entry for those mines. I still would like it if they weren't cloaked after firing ever, but fair enough. I think this helps more than any other change in any of the other patches, with mech being a thing. 50 gas on the armory. So 2 armories is a whole nother factory. Or 50 gas is a tech lab. It's not a huge deal, but those thin timings are the difference between mech having a chance, especially against Zerg, but to an extent, helping against Protoss. Remember, you need an Armory to get 2-2. So in general, to get 2-2, or even a +2 upgrade, it's now 75 gas cheaper for Terran. Because you no longer... That was a big sticking point. Terran versus Protoss is so many players kind of just focusing on 1-1 because getting to an Armory and then getting the +2 upgrades is a big investment that's not going to pay off for several minutes. So, instead of relying on Widow Mines to get the economic damage to keep the Terran going, I think this is a good way of rounding out Terran strength in units that don't one-shot half an economy and are invisible. But speaking of, the Cyclone gets the SA treatment yet again. Okay, so weapon cooldown increased, so attack speed is slower. Lock-on cooldown increased to anything, so that means it can't just continually kite and murder things. Damage bonus per weapon upgrade. This is a buff. But once you get upgrades. Weapon now has turret tracking, turns faster, and remove damage point. So that means it responds instantly, essentially. The damage point is how long it takes after the start of an animation in order to actually attack and do damage. So that is a buff, technically, but it's just a responsiveness buff. Doesn't really change how much damage it does when it's actually firing. And the health is increased. So, after the Cyclone rework, the Cyclone has caused problems for Protoss players at the professional level, which I kind of thought was the point. But as a follow-up to the engineering bay block strategies, you see, blocking the Protoss natural expansion causing them to have to expand. As Hellion Drop and Cyclones are now both difficult to deal with, while appearing similar from a scouting perspective. Cyclones have also been difficult to deal with in early game TVT, causing games to often end up in mass Cyclone versus Cyclone and various all-ins at lower levels. These changes are intended to make the unit less oppressive in the early game, by giving counterplay to lock-on, as well as reducing their damage output, while making them scale a bit better in longer games through the increased health and improved damage. In case they still don't improve the state of the Cyclone, the option to revert it to the previous state will also be considered, which I'm assuming is before we ever changed it in the patch before, which I think would be the easiest way to handle this instead of trying to make your budget Goliath on treads, but here we are. So generally, the Cyclone would beat every Protoss unit, bar none. That's the problem. Like the current pre-this patch Cyclone. Because even the units that technically are comparable in damage or cost could not chase it down until you go Blink. You could maybe go like Phoenixes, which are way more costly than the Cyclone, which is 125.50. But if you go Phoenixes and they didn't go Cyclone, or even if they did, and you get caught out of position, or you get hit by a Widow Mine, and then suddenly those Phoenixes did not pay off. The real problem is when you scout a reactored factory, and this will continue with this patch, is Widow Mines, Hellions, Cyclones. Could be any of the above. And you can't really stick around with something like an Adept to find out. Because if you stick around and it's Cyclones or Hellions, the Adept dies. If you stick around and it's Widow Mines, you might see it, but now you're on Adepts instead of Stalkers. So the risk-reward is not there, very simply. And the ambiguity of scouting a reactored factory is much of the issue, in my opinion, in early Terran versus Protoss, and the strength of just everything that comes out of the factory early and the weakness of it later. Kind of defines the matchup. And moving on. So generally, a significant nerf overall. Probably less likely to be as oppressive early. I don't think it removes its ability to be useful in 2 to 4 sort of numbers early on in TVP. But less of a just like, I always go this and it always pays off sort of choice. The Raven Interference Matrix can no longer target units targeted or affected by Interference Matrix, which allows it to be used with rapid fire. At the cost of being able to continually interfere, of not being able, I believe, is what we're kind of an important distinction. But, so, this is quality of life change. You can't just spam it like 16 on one, I don't know why you have that many Ravens, but on one Siege tank or one Colossus. So it's just, this is mostly a quality of life change. I think you could consider it a buff, but it would also go potentially under like quality of life. So, Terran. Liberator, slightly less range. Widowmine, significant nerf. Armory and Engineering Bay, overall, pretty significant buff to the speed at which you can get your upgrades, both for mech itself and for bio in the mid-game. The Cyclone, now, I don't think this outright makes it unusable at all. I don't know the stats. I haven't looked at, like, the Stalker sits there and fights a Cyclone sort of matchup. But the lock-on cooldown being more than 0, I think, does matter. Especially against things like murdering probes or dealing with Zerglings. It makes it less of a one-size-fits-all and a little bit back closer to where it was, which apparently we're refusing to do right now. I'm still not a fan of the idea of another reactored factory unit, but it's better. Protoss, the Sentry. Damage increased from 6 to 6+4 versus shields. Which, if I had led with this, would make you think this was an April Fool's joke. Which I find hilarious. Now my tickle beams will tickle just a little bit harder, but only against shields. Units like Stalkers and Sentries have a lot of shields. That is literally for Protoss versus Protoss. The light attribute tag removed. So it makes them slightly less vulnerable to Hellions. Now, very importantly, Adepts is the one here we're really looking at. Adepts and Phoenixes will be slightly less able, because right now, 2 Adepts can easily just kill a Sentry by diving on it, even, and they go through force field and all that. We're gonna target. Good luck stabilizing Protoss versus Protoss, but Adepts and Oracles slightly increasing their damage output. Honestly, this is a change. The light attribute tag now means less damage from Banelings. The problem with the Sentry at the end of the day is that it has less range than most units it's supporting. Less range than a Stalker, less range than an Immortal, less range than a Colossus, not less range than an Archon. It's almost impossible to have that. Only Zealots. But, so that is the usual issue. Honestly, I wouldn't mind if there was like a anchor mode, like there is in some of the campaign Sentries, where you could just siege up your Sentry, if only just to cast Guardian Shield and not have it die immediately. But I think this doesn't hurt. Unless you're facing another Sentry and you have shields, in which case it hurts marginally more. Pylon sight range. Spylons. Make Spylons great again. And now Observer. Observer. I've talked a lot about the Observer. Build time reduced by, what is that, about 20%? Health and shields increased from 40-20 to 40-30. Model size increased. Yeah, these changes. Surveillance mode animation speed increased. I assume that means it sieges, unsieges faster? Oh. Animation speed, not how... No, specifically it isn't that. The shield allows observers to survive the splash damage of a single Widowmine shot. You know what? At risk of you know... Good. I like it. It's like, this is kind of a bulletproof vest versus an unloading the gun situation, but we've taken a look at some of the explosive nature of the gun in this case, and we're given 10 more shields. And this helps in every matchup. 10 more health means like 1 more hit from a Stalker or a Marine. Maybe 2 from a Marine. A Hydra. Sure. Protoss detection. Here's the problem with Protoss detection. Okay, not cannons. I don't want to hear about damn cannons. I cannot. Even. It all costs gas. Orbital commands. Minerals. Now, for Zerg, Overseers, 50 gas. But you get supply with it. It comes from an Overlord. It's not fragile. Protoss detection is observers and oracles. That is the realistic detection. Those are two units that easily get killed by things like Widowmines. 2 units that have a tendency to just fly right in. Babysitting your detection is like a solid low double-digit % of your attention. as a Protoss at the high level. We've seen an inordinate amount of games decided by not having detection at this moment. The Lurker's Burrow, the Ghost Cloak, the Widow Mines are in the wrong spot. Kill a Warp Prism even, or something, or a Sentry. So, any of these things, good. Build time on the Observer, good. Good. I would... Good. Model size increase. I've seen some people arguing, and honestly, I can't rule it out. That seeing your own observers, which are relatively hard to see, even when you know they're there, but even when they're part of your own army, it could be hard to see your own observers because they're still kind of shimmery. They look almost half cloaked even to you. So that's not necessarily a terrible thing. Whatever. On the model size, I cover the entire screen if you need to. If you're going to keep buffing the shields a little bit each time, I'm good with that. Feedback can no longer target units with 0 energy, allows it to be used with rapid fire. There's a whole nother argument about whether rapid fire should be like a mechanic we're encouraging, but every single pro uses rapid fire. The very quick, I have a short guide on it. The very quick explanation is you use your keyboard in order to activate abilities at your mouse at the repeat rate of your keyboard. This is how you see the corrosive biles all flung out. This is how you see warp-ins go very quickly. Things like interference matrix and feedback are sometimes used for it as well. And this is to allow more abilities to be more usable with it. This is actually a bit of a buff to like the most teensiest buff. But technically a buff to dealing with things like Vipers and Ghosts. Because at least you're not at risk of feedbacking the same medevac like 6 times or the same Viper Overseer. So there's that. So overall, tangential buffs. We have Sentry, damage against shields, and light attribute. Observer a little faster. Pylon sight range. High Templar feedback. So Protoss got a bit of a tune-up here, but definitely not an overhaul of any sort of meaningful. It's going to be a little easier to see what's coming to kill you. Honestly, I think combined with the other changes, interesting so far. We'll go over it momentarily. Okay. So, Hatchery, Lair and Hive, creep spread radius. This is just the creep from the initial base. And it's only after the base is finished. So you cannon rushers are still going to be able to do your favorite thing. The idea here is the creep at the natural needs to get to where you wall off. Otherwise, Zergs cannot wall off, and they need to, against Adepts, against other Zergs, occasionally against Terran. So you can fit, like, Evo Chambers and Roach Warren in the wall. That is how I read this, is just making it a little more reliable and not kind of pigeonholing. It's mostly requested by map makers, apparently. Yeah, it's mostly a ZVZ concern, and I think is effectively irrelevant in the other matchups where wall-offs are not needed until you already have queens or potentially creep spread. So, technically a buff, but mostly a buff to maps not looking all the same. Infestor. Cyril, what have you done? Well, fungal growth range increase. Vision range while burrowed, though, reduced from 10 to 8. What I'm getting from this, which in my opinion is a bit ridiculous, is the burrowed Infestor had more vision than a Pylon. Which sounds wrong. But apparently. Yeah, okay, well... Yeah. Unburrowed time increased. So the range here is a random delay on unburrowing, so it doesn't look like everybody's part of a hive mind, which is a little ironic because they are. But a lot of units have these kind of random delays. The Widow Mine also has like a random unburrow time. I didn't realize the unburrow time was so large, but this moves the average further. So, and increase the size of moving burrowed infestor visual effects, which I assumed we would have which you still cannot see because there's no visual. But this would be a place to put a GIF or something like that. But I do agree. Have a little tentacle periscope. Not quite like that, but we'll see what that looks like. This is almost explicitly for Cyril, but honestly, Terrans have struggled with dealing with Infestors. Infestors and burrowing and casting, and it can be very short. Now, this is another wombo combo nerf, where it's both the unburrow time and the ability to see them when without detection. We'll see. I don't think this will change too much, as it's still kind of a tough, unless they make it like cloak. Yeah, I would really like a little visual thing here, because even if I was describing it, I'd like to have it to show you, but we'll see on that. I don't mind the idea of the random delay being pushed upwards. It does feel, it is a game-ending move. Now, you could definitely argue, and I'd probably do so, that so many times when you see those fungals land, they are the only way to catch things like Mass Ghost of the Terran army. But maybe with the nerfs to the Widowmine and to an extent ranged Liberators, that Terran ultra late game will be less oppressive, and therefore things like Infestors, especially burrowed behind the lines, should be as well. I'm on board with the idea. Overlord. Transport Overlord morph time increased, so longer, and move speed increased by about 10%. Changes did not create a significant effect on the utility of the unit, and bring back a little bit of the strength of harassment loss from previous baneling nerfs. I think the Overlord, I think this is an interesting one, because the Transport Overlord is pretty underutilized. It does cost money for something that is immediately targeted. We'll see if this changes it to an actual regular use. I think it's one of those things that kind of like shifts in and out of the meta overall. But we'll see. We'll see. And now a few general ones. So summary for Zerg. Creep spread increase for mapmakers. Infestor overall nerf gets a little bit of range on fungal, but burrow and visual burrow is overall nerf to the major use of the unit. Fungal growth range for unburrowed infestors, I think, balances it out a bit. Oh yeah, the vision range, also a big deal. Kind of ridiculous it had more than a pylon, I will say. That does seem high. Fair enough. But now, everyone has workers, except Terran in niche scenarios. So, attack range is increased from 0.1 to 0.2. And you're reading that right. That is effectively melee to slightly longer melee. Like they reach their arms or manipulators a little further. And worker inner radius collision reduced. So I'm not actually sure. Maintain previous interaction with Vespene geysers. Okay. But essentially this is because SCVs sometimes. So this is a nerf to Terran. For the most part. I mean, it's also a buff to defending against things like cannon rushes, because workers will be slightly more responsive, and that range will matter. But not so much that, like, now you can't, now, no matter what, you're going to get attacks up. But just generally making workers a little more responsive. Worker-only paths. You see this one has a profound example of a worker going down to a base that a Reaper cannot immediately jump down to, which is a cool idea. We haven't seen that. Interesting. Zerg rocks. Like regular rocks, but they die over time. So instead of like having something that, I like this idea. They just lose HP over time. Cool. So you can now make like a temporary blocker for dealing with Zergling rushes or Reapers or what have you. And then in the late game, it just opens up on its own. You don't have to waste time dealing with it. I imagine you can also attack it as well. Mineral fields can now be destroyed by collapsible rock towers. Which, we'll see. That's an interesting one of harassing someone's minerals by dropping rocks on them. we'll see how map makers use that. There is a new set of maps, at least some of the maps, not a full rotation, that is coming with this patch, apparently, as well. We're not going to be going over that, but it's not particularly not using too many of these features, if any, but there is a new map pool coming up as well. So bug fixes, quality of life. There are a few in here that are arguable that they're balance changes. But as there always are. So there's a lot of turret animations that are now going to be working regularly, where both turrets of Immortals, Cyclones, and Siege Tanks will kind of track, so they don't have to spend a little bit of extra time turning the turret back to where they're trying to attack. An issue where Banelings, there was a very small use case, but dramatic bug where Banelings could deal additional damage up ramps. Though I talked to Clem himself recently, and he doesn't think it was a huge issue or very noticeable at all, but definitely not something that's ideal. So, activating creep on Overlords now activates for all selected Overlord types. Cool. That's nice. Lurker subgroup priority increased. Now higher priority than Ravager. You know, I really wish we could customize subgroups. Like, for example, the Sentry not necessarily being first over Blink Stalkers kind of stuff. But this is, I assume the Zergs agreed, a solid change. Immortals would not fire while surrounded by units or partially covered by force fields, which, you know, seems lore accurate, but probably not ideal. Various issues with recall. Tempests now deal extra damage to buildings that are flying. So that means the Terrans that lift their buildings will die slightly quicker, which is always a plus. Some Guardian Shield bugs, the Cyclone lock-on bug, the Shield Battery bug, all fixed, assuming this all goes through and works. So, and yeah, overall. So, where does this leave us? So, I lied. I think most of these are indeed quality of life. Like, they're changes, but they're not going to affect how matchups play out. The Widowmine, not severely nerfed, but a real nerf. A real nerf. Splash damage, less punishing. The actual ability, as you can see there, to instead of having like this spider silk line that you're not even sure is there. And I imagine this will be more visible when targeting from, like, in a mineral field where they like to hide their Widow Mines. It's still going to be hard to see Widow Mines, like, hiding behind an orbital dish, but all positive changes. I think all these changes are good. I would definitely argue some of the specifics, like with the Observer, maybe being able to build it out of the Nexus, instead of forcing it to use robo time, but building in less time is essentially a way of doing that. The Widowmine being less invisible, less of the time, while also giving mech and more honest, more conventional Terrans options for going through their builds more smoothly, with the Armory being cheaper and infantry weapons being cheaper. The Cyclone no longer being as ridiculous, as ubiquitous in the early game. Now, again, most of these changes are to Terran, as opposed to significant buffs to Protoss, which is not as exciting. But once again, I do think the idea of these smaller changes now from where we're at is a smart move. And it is a thankless job for anyone involved. And I'm sure no one's trying to go out of their way to make the game not exciting to play or watch. And everybody has a different opinion of what those things exactly are. But I think we're landing on a better version of it. So this gets my professional word talker about commentator thumbs up as a player, much more occasionally because of some of the offending units. Thumbs up for all the races. Cyril, could you please stop getting Zerg nerfed for the rest of us? Would you have some consideration? Please? I don't... But, overall, I can't really think, like... While I think the Ghost is still an incredibly strong unit and the source of a lot of issues in Terran versus Protoss mid to late game, there's also a lot of options mid to late game for Protoss. If you get there, if you survive there, and haven't already been hamstrung by Cyclones or Widowmines overall. So this gives more options for Protoss to get there more regularly. Will this change the meta from being essentially only Blink and an occasional Stargate? I don't think this will make Robo more of a thing. Though, combined with the Sentry getting the... I don't think this changes it much. But I think between the Observer being faster and Mine Drops being less punishing, we could see more Robo in PvT. As that way you can build a Sentry. The Robo only costs 100 gas as opposed to the 150 of a Stargate. So, usually you see a Robo. Yeah, well, we'll have to see if it ends up being a more regular option. It's already Blink into Robo base so much of the time. But I think this opens up more opportunities for Protoss. If only because we're holding the Terrans back a bit. As for Terran, I actually think... I think changes like this are going to have significant impact in all the matchups. Having the Armory be 50 gas cheaper, infantry upgrades significantly cheaper, are going to change and quicken essentially all mid-game timings for those relying on more conventional sort of compositions. So... we'll see how Protoss and Zerg deal with that, but they'll probably deal with it with a few more workers after these changes. As for the late game, especially in Zerg versus Terran, with the Widowmine being somewhat weaker, though arguably a Widowmine with a huge splash radius may actually help Terrans because they won't be caught in the splash as much, but this is a nerf to the main use case of the Infestor, at least at the high level. And the margin between low-level players who actually use Infestors and those, like, actually benefiting from this change, essentially, there's, like, Cyril, and then occasionally Dark, and a couple other Zergs who tried Burrowed Infestors. Then there's everyone else who's like, well, at least the fungal range is up by one. So, maybe they can get something out of it. And then the worker changes. I'm always excited for new map features and ideas for pro gamers to veto. But we'll see on that. It's an interesting one. The worker's only path. Definitely worth trying. I'm sure losing a couple more SCVs will make some players more upset. But it's also a buff to defending cannon rushes. So there's that. So overall, it's a good patch. I wouldn't mind if this patch was added to the game today, which is not something I could say necessarily for the last one. I like the direction we're going. I like the ideas. I like how we're acknowledging map makers still exist and are some of the most passionate people in the community. And we're trying to make more varied strategies possible without only looking at the statistics of a matchup. So, what do you think? I'm sure you've already shared some opinions, but make sure to leave some comments, and we'll see where it ends up. I expect 90%, if not the vast overwhelming majority of these changes to make it into the game in the next few weeks. So, thank you for watching. Good luck, have fun. I hope this breakdown was edutational. I was going for the edutainment thing, but now I'm just going for reading the dictionary, apparently. Let's cut this off before it gets too much worse. Good luck, have fun. I'll see you next time. Thank you for watching. Like and subscribe. Stay chill.